Here's a question that I can't stop thinking about. If every company in your industry is using the same AI, trained on the same data, producing similar results, where does the competitive advantage actually come from? Well, my guest today might actually have the answer, and it's the opposite of what most executives want to hear. Hello, this is Alter Everything. It's a podcast about AI, analytics, and the future of work. I'm Joshua Burkow. My guest today is Dr. Fern Halper, founder of the AI Foundations Group, VP of Research at TDWI, and author of Data Makes the World Go Round. She spent 30 years inside of data and AI, and she has one of the clearest reads I've found on what's actually working inside of enterprises right now and what isn't. Most AI coverage fixates on what tools can do next, what agents will automate, which model wins. Sort of want to ignore all of that today. The more interesting question sits underneath. Most organizations have deployed AI in some form, but few can point to what's actually changed, and the reasons have very little to do with the models. So 3 things I want to hash out with Fern today. 1, where companies actually get stuck, something that she calls the value ceiling. 2nd, what predictive analytics adoption curve from the last decade tells us about where agentic AI lands in this decade. And then lastly, with the question that I opened with, in a market where everyone uses the same tools, where does that competitive edge come from? Let's get into it. Fern, welcome. Do I have this right? You started in oceanography. You spent years at the Bell Labs on continuous monitoring and led research as well as at TDWI through the last 3 major data waves. And this year you founded the AI Foundations Group. I really can't imagine how many times you've seen the same cycles sort of come and go.
Yeah, you have it right.
Time flies. So instead of going back over all this history and data world, which I think you could cover in droves, I'd actually like to start where we're at. You've written this in 2026 as an inflection point and not a sort of breakthrough year that a lot of people are talking about. What is that sort of signal that you look for that tells you that this is really an inflection point versus sort of just another round of hype?
Right. I was writing about the inflection point in my blog, and I said that organizations are trying to make their way towards agentic AI, and that 2026 was actually going to be a year of building. So I think that year of building is around the foundations that are needed for both generative AI that uses company data and then agentic AI, which of course uses company data also. And in my research at TDWI, I see that organizations are sort of slightly more than midway through this journey, although it's obviously a continuous journey because everything is always changing. So what I'm looking for to tell me whether or not the inflection point is real is around both data readiness for AI and then the operational readiness for it. So the data readiness, I'm looking at data around data silos, organizations consolidating, unifying, as well as unstructured data. I'm seeing that in my research that organizations that have a significant impact from AI, they believe that the data foundation is table stakes. So there's this group that has actually made progress with AI, and they obviously view that data foundation as table stakes because when you ask them what their early mistakes were around data silos and thinking that they could just layer AI on top of fragmented data foundations that weren't governed, and they realized that that was a problem. But I do think that they still now this year have to deal with unstructured data, and they're putting more mature handling of unstructured data in place. So those are the 2 signals in terms of the data foundation. And then in terms of operationalizing AI, I'm looking at whether organizations have the right skills and tools and roles in place. So a lot of organizations have thought about new roles like ops people and engineering roles, so are they putting those in place? Are they also doing things like building or buying tools around agent registries or tools that's going to help to monitor agents? Basically, are they taking steps to get themselves into production? So those are the types of signals that I'm looking for.
Yeah, those are pretty clear if you're paying attention to them, right? I think you're a student of history as well, as we've both been in this game for a little bit. Do you sort of chuckle and smile and when you see sort of these patterns happen again, where people are, looking at it and say, hey, data is really important? We sort of comment around the 2012 big data wave that came in, and then 2017 when machine learning wave came in. There were a lot of these where, again, the data foundations were so important. Do you see that as well?
Well, in terms of the big data wave, I think data people got excited about it, but not necessarily consumers of software to the extent that they are with AI. So in some way, this is a bit different. But certainly, like, the big data wave was about getting people excited about what they could do with a lot of data and how you can enrich your data and get much better results. It was about how to deal with the data. To me, this is so much more complex than that is. It's about the data, it's about the organization, it's about the skills, it's about the governance. Everything has to be part of the system to achieve success, really. So, yeah, it's the wave, but this one has gotten so many people excited that in some ways it's a little bit different. It's sort of a sea change. Wait, that's
Yeah.
not a good. I was an oceanographer. Wait a minute, that's not a. It's not a good analogy.
Good pun. I got
It's
you.
a
I got
tsunami
you.
as opposed to a wave. How about that?
Yeah. We've never heard that marketing slogan of tsunamis, right? So when you talk to executives, going back to the sort of importance of the data foundation, do you get the sense that more and more execs are coming to the table and realizing that they don't have to waste cycles, going down these roads, when if they really rely on building a good, strong data foundation? Do you see that more often, or is that sort of worried that it's sort of falling away and they're not sort of getting the historical lessons here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of them aren't getting the historical lessons, and certainly, we see executives stepping down because they don't think that they know enough about AI. A lot of them didn't even think about the data foundation to begin with. They just sort of jumped right into off-the-shelf consumerized AI without even thinking about what was underneath, and just said, let's do AI, whatever that means. So yeah, obviously there are a lot that are thinking about it, and it depends who you talk to. But I definitely hear you on that one.
Yeah. It's one of those things where you can sort of have a conversation within 5 minutes and understand if they're really capturing the essence of the fact. Like, you're sort of hinting at it, is that there's a lot more behind the curtain of this world that we're going into. Fern, you actually have a concept that you call the value ceiling. I hope I get that right. From what I gather, it's this point where sort of individual productivity gains from these off-the-shelf AI tools stop translating into organizational value.
Yeah, you have that right. In the book that I just wrote, I talk about a value ceiling in the context of sort of an AI maturity journey. And certainly with generative AI, a lot of organizations, as I was saying before, they were trying to leapfrog over foundational capabilities that they otherwise would have had to put in place for AI, machine learning, predictive analytics. So that includes the data foundation. So as they're using these off-the-shelf consumerized tools, that are really point solutions, they're mostly getting what they think are productivity gains from it. So in this curve, I talk about quick wins in low-risk use cases, right? Things like generating code to build a website or using generative AI to write content. But then the curve actually flattens, and they won't get to truly high value if they don't have the foundations in place. So I show like a plateau, and that's where the ceiling comes in. The ceiling is the plateau of the curve because they get stuck. And once they have those foundations in place, the organization, the data, the skills, the governance, the operational know-how, then the curve can start to grow upwards again.
Got it. That makes sense. Are you able to sort of help elucidate this idea for folks who maybe are new to this and can see what does a company go through when they're doing it? Is it just a matter of going through and getting all those foundational elements in line, or how have you seen this sort of come to fruition?
It's so interesting because when you have conversations with people and they're talking about AI, it almost takes 10 minutes before you can figure out what they're actually talking about when it comes to
Oh, I
AI.
so agree with that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then, once I sort of explain about the consumerized path versus the organizational company enterprise path that uses company data, then we come to a little bit of a different conversation. So it just takes a while, and they've all heard, data's the new oil or whatever, data assets. So they sort of get that, and then they understand about what they may be struggling with.
Yeah, I'm sort of empathetic to this idea too, because you talk to a lot of folks, even the ones like us who've been around a while, that nobody is an expert in every area of a business. Governance can people live their whole careers doing governance alone, let alone having to make sure that we get that sort of managed appropriately and implemented appropriately. Like if you put me in the shoes of say a leader, and I come to you, say, Fern, help me out. I'm trying to my best to get out of the sort of AI hype of things and get going. What are some of the first landscape pieces? Like where would you go straight to data and say, hey, how's your data foundation? Or what would you sort of advise from your point of view?
Yeah, well, I always say that they should start with the business need, that there's no point in building AI that doesn't solve a business need. But if they were using off-the-shelf AI, and then if they're struggling to actually take the next step, like say they're trying to build an application like a chatbot that interacts with customers, and maybe they had a general chatbot before, or maybe one that was using company FAQs to provide information to customers, but they want to expand it. And to do that, they're going to need to access customer data. And then they find out that they have 10 different ways to define a customer, and those are going to provide different data about the customer. Then they should know that they have a problem, right? Or if they build a simple model and they see that outputs are garbage, that indicates that their data is flawed or biased. So I think that you have to get to the data question pretty quickly. What's the business issue that you're trying to solve? Then do an honest inventory of what data you have in place to solve it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then pretty quickly you're going to see, well, do I have that in place, or do I, not have it in place? But even getting to that point to think, oh, where's all of that data? What does that inventory look like? And it doesn't have to be every piece of data that you have in the company, but just, to solve that business need, and then you can build out and out and out. But it's just interesting what happens with some companies.
Yeah, there is this sort of trade-off, and you hinted at this one again, is the honest assessment of it. I've been so gung-ho about the results and the outcomes and trying to get to a specified goal that I don't look as honestly and cleanly at what's really there, right? Like, hey, do I have all the elements? Do I have 50% of it? Is it a hot mess, or is it in good shape? And can I sort of talk to that fairly eloquently? I think we can't shortcut that, right?
You can't. And it's just so interesting now, too, because the types of applications that companies are building now, they're using unstructured text data. So,
Yeah.
we're so used to dealing with the structured data, and now they're using the unstructured documents. And I was looking at the results of a survey recently, and I was just floored by the biggest use case was basically around documents and customer
That's right.
notes and those sorts of things. And so even if they had some sort of structured data infrastructure in place, a lot of organizations don't have the right unstructured
Yeah.
repositories in place. So some of it's not even their fault, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. Totally agree. Anything else that you find really interesting about the value ceiling and how it's sort of playing out from the point at which you wrote about it?
Yeah, I guess I've been thinking a lot about, where when organizations think that they're actually making progress because, they have these co-pilots or whatever in place. And I've been thinking about it sort of in terms of the illusion of progress versus actual progress. So they have a lot of activity, but they don't necessarily have measurable impact from their AI. I just think that that's important, that you always have to measure, think about what the measurements are. Those that have put the work in with the data and other foundations are the ones that I always see measuring value in production. And those that aren't are stuck in the pilots and experimentations under that plateau. And I think that in terms of any sort of gaps that organizations have to fill, if they actually want to grow, like they can keep getting, I guess, productivity enhancements, but if they actually want to grow the value of what they're trying to do, they have to move past the illusion of progress to actual progress, if that makes sense.
No, totally. I mean, again, talk about history lessons, right? Like the machine learning and data science, when that all came about, it was the same thing. It was this idea that we have the smartest people on the planet, and data scientists are essentially gods of the universe. And they had a lot of the hoopla and the hype, but like, were they making a real dent in actual progress, real progress that was changing the company? And I think that was the underlying assessment that I got, was that the change management still to this day is the hard thing, is the thing that I would argue most companies are not great at, is getting those things into place and doing the hard work and doing the foundational aspects to make these things take hold and actually make progress. What a concept, right?
Right. Not to mention actual change management. I remember when I was at Bell Labs and we could actually predict customers that were going to disconnect AT&T services, and we were very excited about it. We had built the model. This was a long time ago, and AT&T, I'm sure, does all sorts of advanced things now because they were doing advanced things back then. But, we went to the people who ran the call center and said, we can predict who's going to disconnect, the service. And they just looked at us like we had 5 heads. And, why would we do that? And how would we do that? And how would we operationalize that? And, certainly all of the compute power wasn't there at the time to actually do that. But
Make it viable, yeah.
yeah, but it just goes to a cultural type of change that is also sort of needed. So
Yeah, I totally agree. We're trying to get this new incredible technology, amazing technology in place, but it's just the tip of an iceberg that has all these things together. Your data foundations, you got to get the skill sets right, all these pieces. One of the ones that I want to shift to is the big topic of governance. And I'm really interested in your thoughts and your ideas around this, because I talk about governance a lot. I never really saw AI governance the same as sort of data governance. I've always sort of saw, okay, they have the same word in them, but they're pretty different disciplines, maybe like different foundational sort of concepts here. And a lot of companies treat them as sort of the same thing. That seems like a problem.
completely agree with you. I view that data governance and AI governance are complementary. And certainly, there's data governance for AI, but AI governance is something that's different, right? It's going to deal with the models, not the data. So data governance never had to deal with things like versioning and documenting AI models. It didn't deal with model registries. It didn't need to deal with explainability of outputs or observability for looking at models and how they decay. They're different. If you don't have good data governance, you're not going to have good AI. But
Yeah.
I've seen organizations, same as you, like try to treat them the same, then try to make it two completely different groups that are dealing with it. But, now they're sort of
Right.
coming together and saying, yeah, we all should be under the same umbrella. AI governance is different than data governance, but, there's overlap with what you have to be thinking about. But, it's the same thing where people built models, but they never thought about operationalizing them. And now they're building AI models, but they're not thinking about governing them. So it's a conundrum, but organizations are at least getting on board with it now to actually think about how they're going to govern their AI models, which is good
Yeah.
news.
Right. And I think the interesting thing is, It's like we've got, sort of the LLM world that we're dealing with, but now agentic AI is coming out quick, and you've got all these other concepts like MCP and other components. Those are sort of new grounds to figure out what AI governance looks like.
Yeah, it's so much more complex. I mean, governing a machine learning model, that's hard enough, right? And the vendors I talk to about agentic AI, they talk about, oh, access controls. Well, we provide access controls, like somehow that solves everything. Or at least that's the place to start. But I don't know that I agree with that. I think if you're going to build and govern an agentic system, you need to actually start with what that system is going to do. So you have to map it out. You have to look at where all of the control points in that system need to be, the inputs, the outputs, what happens in the agents, how they interact with each other. And so the governance design needs to come up front, with your system design. I mean, how many people are thinking about that? And you have to decide whether you're willing to live with the terms of the risk, as you map that out. I've been actually hearing from people who are talking about that these agentic systems to start out with should be more deterministic and just perform certain tasks, rather than letting them be more probabilistic and, go a little bit wild. So I think that makes sense, in terms of AI governance. The good news, though, is that organizations are getting on board with it. They're saying, absolutely, we have to do this. And, that in any conference that I'm at, in TDWI research that I do, everyone's saying, whoa, 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 in terms of their agentic systems, we got to put the guardrails in there first. So at least they're thinking, first, because I guess some organizations sort of said, let's just build the agents and see what happens. And, now they're stuck with tens of thousands of agents, and they're saying maybe that wasn't a good idea. So, different companies, different philosophies.
It's really wild when you think about it, because the two that come to mind is just the cost implications, right? I don't know if I've met anyone that could tell you, hey, I've got 10 analysts working and they cost me exactly this amount based on whatever work they're going after in use of LLMs and the Claude codes and codecs of the world, and building stuff. And so there's this sort of, just from a cost management point of view, that's one area. The other one that I'm finding really interesting and is tied in closely with AI governance is the legal aspects. And I'm curious if you have any points of view on that or any hard lines on that realm, because what I'm seeing is legal is as an organization is sort of having to force themselves in to say, hey guys, you got to think about this more clearly. And then there's the sort of push and pull that's happening in a lot of organizations around, yeah, just don't worry about it. Let's just try this out, like you said, and we're gonna see where the boundaries are, and we'll come back to you.
I'm hearing a lot more organizations, when I talk to them, they're saying the legal is part of the governance team, and they're trying to interpret the compliance obligations that they have, et cetera. And certainly, you think about GDPR even. I don't think people were thinking about like AI models, but yet, there is a provision in there that says if someone wants to open a credit card and you deny them, you have to be able to explain to them why you denied them, so you need to understand what you're doing, and all of that needs to be governed in some way. And now it seems like people are realizing, oh, I have to be able to explain that or whatever, and then you look at the EU AI Act, which is even more explicit about certain things. So legal definitely has to get involved, and that's other good news. I think that the organizations I'm talking to are bringing them in.
Yeah. I think one more question I want to shift into the next sort of theme here is, do you see, with all the new things coming out from MCP to all the new technologies that are coming into AI world, do you think this is not going to be a sort of settled field or settled practice for quite a while? Do you think it's going to?
I think it's early. What I see a lot of organizations doing is that they're trying to take the frameworks that are out there for AI governance, and then they take, some of the big four firms, they take pieces of it and then they try to put it together as their own framework, when they're not rushing into it, I guess I would say. Because not only do they have to sort of put a framework together, they have to put an operating model together about what that looks like in their company and, dealing with this and how do we get the business stakeholders involved. And like you were saying, legal is involved, IT, there's just like lots of different people who are involved. And I think it's just going to take a while. And that was just for, sort of thinking about generative AI and not even agentic. I just think I haven't seen really good frameworks out there that look at agentic AI. Like I was saying, I think it's case by case, mapping it out, thinking about it from an auditing and control perspective, et cetera. And that's just going to take a while.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I could probably foresee entire companies coming out and just focusing on how to govern agentic AI. By itself is it gives me a headache just thinking about it. Like it's a true challenge.
It's interesting because the auditing field, I've tried to keep up with it a little bit since my days at Bell Labs dealing with continuous process auditing. Auditors are now talking about using agents to audit agentic AI systems. So that talk about your mind-boggling. Yeah. So
Try to get your head wrapped around that one. Like who audits who now? Like
right,
it's
right,
we essentially have to get to a place where that's possible, right? Where every corner of a corporation or enterprise can tap into the power of agentic AI, but have mechanisms in place that make it safe and reliable and auditable and ability to go back to the regulators and say, hey, this is how we did exactly this thing, the credit application, right? Yeah, it's fascinating.
and supply chain is going to be a big one, right, for agentic AI. So how are you
Can't
auditing?
imagine.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
going to be very interesting. We're not. I don't think we're there yet by any stretch. So that's just my opinion.
I got my career started in supply chain, and I've always been fascinated because it's this sort of multi-dimensional problem at all times, trying to get all these moving pieces working together. And then to your point, you add AI on top of that. It's not this sort of segmented approach that could work. It's got to be pretty comprehensive and then complex. And agentic AI is highly complex already, right?
Right, right.
One thing that surprised me, Fern, in your recent writing is that the deepest risk isn't governance failure, but it's something sort of quieter happening to the people that are using these tools every day. And I just did my previous podcast was about sort of AI and people. You wrote in February that in an AI saturated market, original thought becomes a scarce asset. Can you unpack that for me? Can you sort of give me the underlying why scarce? Why now?
Yeah, I guess, we've been talking a little bit about it, but what I see happening is that many organizations are making use of AI tools, the co-pilots, the assistants, the chat GPTs, the thousands of other tools that are out there. In TDWI research, more than 90% of them are making use of those off-the-shelf self-service types of tools. And, those models were trained on a corpus of data that was the internet. But as more organizations are using generative AI to create something, and that something is let loose on the world, like marketing content, then the models become trained on data that's already generated, and the outputs average towards the center of the distribution, of the bell curve. It's just becomes this homogenized thinking, and everyone's just sort of at the middle of the bell curve. So, to me, that's not where original thought occurs. It's not at the center, it occurs at the long tail. So then if that tail is smaller, then the probability of original thought decreases, because if everyone's just putting prompts into generative AI systems, I mean, to me, like, where's the creativity and insights? I mean, maybe there is some in some cases. I feel like, we all become mediocre. And I remember someone in a survey a couple of years ago was asking about how if people were positive or negative towards AI, and these were data and AI professionals. And, most of them were really positive about it, but there were a couple people who were saying, we're just tending towards mediocrity. And I've been thinking more and more about that. It's sort of like a bad sci-fi show, where generations before wise people had created technology, and now the sad-looking people that are currently here can't fix it when it breaks, So
Yeah.
just made me think a lot about what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing, and when you read articles that are online and whatever, and you're just sort of saying everyone's saying the same thing. It's just all homogenized thinking at this point.
Yeah, it's really such a fascinating thing. When I try to share why I'm excited about AI is the creative part. On the whole, I don't consider myself highly creative. What I found with AI, for me at least, is it allows me to get my messed up thoughts, and messed up meaning not bad, but messed up like untangle them a little bit and get some original thoughts, get some ideas that might have a sort of spark of creativity, a spark of sort of, hey, I wonder if anybody else has come to this crossroads of these two ideas, and then just flushing it out. I mean, I probably spend way more tokens on that than anything. Is just sort of going down these rabbit holes of sort of flushing these things out. And I think AI's been pushed so much to the realm of, hey, it's a productivity tool. Like, it's go in, get your work done. You can automate your PowerPoints, you can automate your Excel documents, you can automate your workflows. Let's go. And those are all great. I'm not sort of harping on those, but are they at odds, right? Are we sort of sacrificing this ability to do these productive things without having the sort of original thought to be like, maybe there's a better way, you know? Maybe we could think through this and come up with new creative ideas that evolve this dialogue and conversation.
Yeah, I guess I think that when they talk about food groups or whatever, how to stay healthy, it's a balance. So maybe, this is also a balance of things, because certainly I'm not saying you can't get creative ideas out of AI, because if you know enough and your critical thinking, your creativity is enough that you're putting the right thing into the prompt window, then, you may get something useful back. And certainly we've all been helped, I'm sure, by the off-the-shelf generative AI tools that are out there.
Yeah. Can you sort of help paint a picture of how you think this plays out in an enterprise? Like, what would you do? Well, how would we sort of affect this if we were so bold to think we could?
From a leadership perspective, I think that, yeah, that effective leaders need to sort of design for augmentation and not substitution. That means they have to be explicit about where AI is appropriate and where it's not appropriate. Like maybe, AI can help accelerate your documentation or your initial exploration, but you still need to be expected to define the problem, validate the assumptions, defend the results, make sure that they're correct. What I see some organizations doing is implementing practices like requiring their data analysts to explain or critique generated outputs, or even like to produce a first pass answer before using AI. And, I remember back when I was in graduate school, my major professor was saying, look at the data. Look at the data. Don't just run the analysis. So you don't want to restrict it. You just want to ensure that AI doesn't replace thinking. You want to
That's
keep your
right.
teams sharp. You want to embed AI, or sort of embed the thinking into the
Yeah.
process, checking the logic and verifying the sources. And some organizations are putting peer review processes that specifically look for AI errors, or, show your reasoning.
I really like this because it's easy to automate this process, do this thing, essentially get my work done. If we don't augment the thinking along with what we're doing, that's the drain. That's the drain of original thought. It's juxtaposed against a sort of personal experience I've had with our CEO, and I work closely with him on AI projects, and he's very much pushing the gamut. Like, hey, let's think different. Let's not do the same sort of AI slop that everybody else. What other new things could we build? What other original ideas could we come up with?
Yeah, but when I look at companies that are transforming, basically, it goes back to what we were saying before. It's not necessarily the ones who are just using off-the-shelf AI tools. It's the ones, that are putting the foundations in place and doing all the hard work. They're reaping the benefits from it. And that's not to say that someone just can't come along and come up with an idea and say, oh, let's create an app that does X, Y, and Z for our customers and we can make millions of dollars. Obviously, that's happening, but I'm looking at more sustained and more potential for growth. So that's how I'm looking at it.
Yeah, imagine that world where you have sustained original thought and a strong foundation that is reliable and audible and all these things. That's perfect recipe for growth. Yeah, that's pretty foundational. I want to get into this next piece, sort of a hard transition, but it's the sort of idea of this predictive analytics precedent. And you've written that predictive analytics follows the same sort of adoption pattern Agentic AI is following.
Yeah, when I got to TDWI, I started asking organizations whether they were if they were implementing predictive analytics. And every year, every quarter or whatever, I'd be asking the same question. And then I'd also ask, are you planning to do this or you're experimenting with it now? And if organizations continued on the same path and actually were doing what they thought that they were going to do, with predictive analytics, the adoption would have been at 80% already, and it's more like 35 to 45%. So I think that in some ways, maybe agentic AI is a little bit different. I can't say it for certain, but now if I see 30 to 40% of organizations responding to surveys saying that they're experimenting with agentic AI, but only about 10 to 20% have it in production, it's sort of the same idea, like where's it going to be in the next couple of years? What would adoption be like 10 years from now? It's also more complex, as we were talking about before.
That's right.
So I think that's going to strike some companies down. And I don't like to sound negative because, I've always been interested in what the next thing is. But I just think that people underestimate what's actually involved. So that always concerns me.
Yeah, hindsight's always 20/20, isn't it? But then once you start to see these things sort of get into the organizations and actually get put into place and then get way down that pathway, say 5 years, 10 years, you start to see the difference of what was really hyped to the beginning to the end. I mean, big data had it, machine learning had it, predictive analytics had it. I mean, I even think, AI is so pervasive, right? My mother, who is technophobe to the degree that I can't explain. Like, I can barely get her to use her phone, but she's using an LLM. Like, that to me is wild that like it's pervasive. It's being used in every person either knows of it or does it. It's not like machine learning or predictive analytics where you had to have some sort of quant background, some interest in it, some sort of love for data of that sort. So smaller population. Does the fact that AI expand all corners of the earth change the landscape there?
Yeah, that's what I think. I think because it's so well known at this point and everyone's using it, like you're saying, your mother, my sister talks about, I talked to Chat. Chat said this. I said, you don't call it Chat GPT. And she said, no, that's too long. I just call it Chat. So they have their
Yeah,
own
yeah.
lingo. Maybe agentic AI will get further because everyone's talking about agents and it's not going anywhere. Yeah, maybe it's not going to take off to the degree that some people thought, but I don't think it's going anywhere, and people are
Yeah.
understanding it more, I think, in some ways.
Yeah. All right. I got a fun one for you, Fern. So, one of the things that I like to do on this podcast is do what we call a lightning round, where I'm going to sort of throw a few things at you and get your sort of quick, immediate reaction. Nothing too elaborate or in depth. And they're meant to be sort of quick, instinctive answers, but hopefully no curveballs. I don't try to surprise you too much. You good for it?
I'll give it a try.
All right. All right. So I have 6 of them here. Let's see how they go. So give me one signal a company has hit the value ceiling without realizing it. What's one thing that you see it and you're like, oh, yep, you're there.
Okay, so when I see that they're using AI, but their business outcomes aren't improving, they can't measure value.
Can't measure value. That's a good one. One thing AI governance has to do that data governance never did.
I'll say monitor the outputs of models, so monitor software outputs.
That's a good one. Good. One habit that protects critical thinking on a team using AI every day.
That's a good question. Deliberately do work without AI on some days.
Ooh, good
How
one.
about that?
You're going to start a riot in the streets on that one.
Yeah, I try to do that. I say, don't use it, don't use it, don't use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. One vendor claim about agentic AI that you do not believe in yet, or you do not believe.
Yeah, I don't believe that companies are putting multi-agent systems to work in a production environment in any meaningful way. I don't think that there are fully autonomous agents running end-to-end business processes without human oversight. And I guess, vendors are talking about everyone, you need human oversight,
Yeah.
but then they also talk about, that agents are your team members, which is another interesting cultural type of dynamic. So
That's right. Next one is one skill that stays valuable for the next 10 years, regardless of how fast all these tools move.
how about having good judgment, being able to frame problems, assess trade-offs, although I guess agents are going to help doing that, and making decisions under uncertainty.
Being able to think through these things critically. All right, last one. You've done amazing so far. So one question every executive should ask before greenlighting an AI project. What should be that one question?
How does this change what we're doing, and is it worth the change?
Which probably shouldn't be much different than the other projects that they're greenlighting, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that
yeah,
sounds pretty straightforward.
yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to we'll ask a quick question to sort of to round it out, and then I think we can let you go. But if a listener runs a data or analytics team and is listening to this podcast, and they want to move beyond the sort of productivity theater into sort of real value, they want to actually enact that change, what would you advise them to move forward on? We're not talking to the executive per se, but talking to the data analyst or the analytics team or that newly minted AI engineer. What would you have for them?
I guess if their organization thinks that AI is just an off-the-shelf tool and they want to move further and push the needle further in terms of thinking about, their AI programs, then they might start with an AI incubator team. It's a concept that is a small group. They listen to business problems. They try out new ways to solve it. I mean, like in some ways, the center of excellence that I was in at Bell Labs long ago, was we wanted to solve business problems in new ways, and they follow a framework to solve certain problems. And one thing to be sure is that you set metrics, success metrics, as you do this, because I always say that success begets success, because I've seen that over and over again, and it's really a virtuous circle. If you can do something where you can show that you delivered value and you measured it, then people start to get excited. Oh, that worked. Look at that. Let's do the next thing.
Keep it going. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, Fern, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I'm very grateful for your wisdom here. I think this has been immensely valuable. If people want to follow up with you, follow sort of what your book and connect with you, what would be the right place to do that?
Well, they can connect with me on LinkedIn. They can send me an email go to aifoundationsgroup.com, and all of my information is there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll make sure that we post that in the show notes. But with that, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you.
That was fun to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Well, that was a fun conversation. Here's a few key takeaways that I took from my conversation with Fern. The first one is that the value ceiling is real. Most organizations, they're using AI, but they can't point to the business outcomes that actually improved. And they can't measure the value. That's the ceiling. And most companies are actually sitting right under it, and they aren't even realizing it.
The second thing is that AI governance is not data governance with a new name. Fern points out that a key difference is that it has to monitor the output of models, not just the inputs. And with agentic systems, auditing becomes a whole new problem. Even Fern pointed out that auditors are now using agents to audit agentic AI. It's a field that's still being figured out. Now, the last one is the one that I'll probably be chewing on for quite a while. Original thought is now becoming a scarce asset. And I don't say this tongue-in-cheek or being snarky, but as more of us use the same tools, trained on the same data, the outputs drift towards the center of the bell curve. The answer isn't to use less AI, it's to design for augmentation, not substitution. Ask your team to critique what it gives back. Ask them to deliberately work without AI on some days. We need that thinking muscle, that thing that you have to protect. Now, before you go, if you like today's episode, can I ask you a personal favor and share it with your friends and colleagues? Let us know what resonated, what you want us to explore next, what is interesting to you. You can email us at podcast@alteryx.com. That's ALTERYX. And you can subscribe to Alter Everything on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. I really appreciate you listening, and we'll see you next time.